called Mom. My mother had me when she was 17 years old. I'm the product of a one-night stand. My father is 10 years older than me, but I never knew him until I was about 10 years old. I didn't even know he existed because he was in jail for the first 10 years of my life. He was a drug dealer. So I never knew what he looked like until one day I'm 10 years old and my grandmother's like, oh, your father got out of jail. He wants to see you. And I'm like, what in the world? Like, what father? I had a grandfather who I thought was my father, and I called him Dad, and I called my grandmother Ma, so didn't know that I had an actual father. While growing up with my grandmother, my mother, she was in and out. She was barely around. She did have another kid, so my sister's she was like 3 years old when I was 9, so my grandmother also had my mother at 17 years old, and my mother was actually raised by my grandmother's mother, so a generational thing of having kids at 17 and letting the grandparents raise them. For as long as I can remember, my grandmother always had a boyfriend, so he lived with us. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with my brother, my aunt, who was 5 years older than me, so she was raised like my sister. I remember people used to always say like, oh, you know, your mom, talking about my grandmother, and I would get so mad, like, she's not my mom, she's my grandmother, even though I called her mom, so I don't know why I would get so upset, and then they would think my aunt was my sister, and I'm like, that's not my sister, that's my aunt. And I laugh about it now, thinking how funny it is, because she actually is legally my mom. On my birth certificate, I found out when I was a teenager that on my birth certificate, they changed my mom's name to my grandmother's name. So now we laugh about it now. My uncle, who I recently went to go see, I call him my brunkle because he's my brother by legally adoption, but he's my uncle, so now he's my brunkle. We didn't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables growing up, although we did have one grocery store up the street from where we lived at. My grandmother was living off of $1,000 a month, which is what she got from adopting my brother and I and having us in foster care. So not a lot of money, which she wasn't working, so she had to use that money to pay her rent, to feed us, to feed my aunt. I remember her saying that fresh fruits and vegetables wouldn't fill us, and so we had lots of processed food, lots of things that would fill us. And although she was from Alabama, and so she knew how to cook, but she was cooking food that I didn't like, so she had lots of gravy and pork chops and peas, and I never liked any of those things, so I would just go to bed hungry and say I was going to eat at school the next day. I got free lunches at school. The closest thing that I ever had to a vegetable growing up was canned corn, and so, which is not a vegetable anyway, so I guess I didn't really have any vegetables unless it was on a burger, and probably had a slice of lettuce. There are definitely some key moments in my life that impacted me, and I can so clearly remember them as having an impact on me now as an adult. I remember family members telling other family members, oh, you should do foster care because you can get money and you don't have to work. And I remember times when we played hide and go seek and seeing things happen to kids that shouldn't happen, but not knowing exactly what it was. I remember my grandmother telling me that I would end up like my mom. At the time, I had no idea what she was talking about, but a couple years later, I found out that my mom had been arrested multiple times for selling herself, and that the guy that she was with since my sister was 2 years old was actually her pimp. I remember overhearing a phone conversation of family members telling each other how to fill the disability check so that you can, or the disability test so that you can get a check and then don't have to work. Everything was about not working. Recently, my uncle sent me a clip of a news article that named the projects that I grew up in as one of the worst projects in New York City. And they can be a very dangerous place, especially if you didn't have family, you got beat up. So since it was just me and my brother mostly outside, we didn't have family, but I quickly realized that if you acted crazy, people left you alone. So I'd walk around with a sock and I would put rocks in it and tie it, and I would swing it around because if anybody was gonna jump me, because there was lots of gangs, that I was gonna hit them with the rocks. So I never felt like I could be myself because I'm not a crazy person, but I always felt like I had to act crazy since my brother, he was younger than me and he was very feminine, and if you could imagine being an African-American boy in the projects, people wanted to beat him up, and so I would always have to defend him, whether they were boys or girls. So I just always felt like I had to be aggressive towards people. I never felt like I could be myself, and so I was very angry at that because I'm like, I don't want to be this person, but I just felt like I had to. I remember the day that my grandfather, who I call Daddy, he died, and he was the only person that I ever thought really loved me, and so I was really heartbroken. My mother was the oldest kid out of my grandmother's 3 kids, and I remember them telling me, oh, your grandfather, he's not actually your grandfather, and I was so confused. My grandfather, he was very light-skinned, pale, with green eyes, and I never wondered why my mom looked different from him, but apparently my mom was a one-night stand as well for my grandmother, and we never knew her biological father. My grandmother never told us anything about him except for that he was married and that he had a wife and kids and didn't want any more kids. So my grandmother and I never really got along after growing up because I didn't want to follow her rules, so obviously that got me into a lot of trouble. She would want me to come home when the street lights came on in the summer, which came on around 8 o'clock, and I didn't want to come home at 8 o'clock, so I would make excuses of that I didn't see the lights coming on. And I wasn't doing bad things all the time, but sometimes I just wanted to stay outside with friends because that was when the fun was happening. But I did love and appreciate her for taking us in and getting us out of foster care. When I was 15 years old, I ended up asking my grandmother. I got my first job, which was close to my mom, where she lived, my biological mom, and I asked my grandmother, can I spend the summer with my mom so I could get to know her, since I didn't really have a relationship with her. And I have no idea why she agreed, but she did. And so I decided to move with my mom, and then after the summer was over, I told my mom, oh, can I just stay with you even during school, because I knew my mom didn't have rules and my grandmother did. My mom was very young, and she is still really young. She looks like my sister, so when people see her, they think that she's my sister. And so I love living there because she treated me like a sister and not like a child, so I had no rules. I also had a boyfriend that lived down the street. It was my first serious relationship, and after she agreed, I was so happy, and she said, okay, you can stay with your mom as long as you don't change your address for the school, because if you do, then I'll stop getting a foster care check for you. And I was just like, sure, like I don't care what you do with that money. It wasn't taking care of me anyway. I'm working now, so I thought like, oh yeah, I'm big and bad. I'm 15, I'm out on my own, and living with my mom was not good at all. I was dating the guy, he kept cheating on me. I remember talking to my father and saying, Dad, this guy keeps cheating on me, I love him. And my dad said, well, sweetie, all guys cheat. You just have to find the one that comes home to you. And I was like, well, that's crazy. If all guys cheat, then I don't want to be with guys. So then I started dating girls off and on, because obviously I'm like, well, I don't cheat, and so girls must not cheat. And so at the same time, I was still trying to make it work off and on with the same guy. And so over the years, that led to multiple terminated pregnancies before I finally ended up having my son at 19. I remember the first time I got pregnant, I was 16 years old. I would have gave birth at 17, and I had already sworn to myself from young that I was not going to have a kid at 17 because that's what my grandmother did, and that's what my mom did, and I wanted to be different from them. And I didn't really know anything else except for that I can make it not happen, and so I did. I knew that I wanted a child, but I was like, no, I don't want to have a child at 17, and I don't want to end up like my grandmother and my mother, so I didn't. And I think back and I think about how people, they grow up certain ways and then they end up in the same situations, but I was like, that's not going to be me. I always had a goal in my life, and I was like, I don't want to end up like my grandmother and my mother. So while people were doing drugs and alcohol and all the things, I was not. I tried those things, but I would never to the point to get drunk or high because I always wanted to be in control of what I did. I watched too many Lifetime movies. My grandmother loved Lifetime movies, and so what is it called? Crimes, that unsolved mysteries, that's what it was. And I would always see these crazy stories about people getting kidnapped or drugged or raped or sex trafficked, and I was just like, well, I don't want that to happen to me. So I'm like, I'm not smoking weed, I'm not, doing drugs, I'm not drinking alcohol because I want to be in control of what happens to me. I don't want to wake up the next day and not know what's going on. So at age 18, this led to me getting arrested because I was with my son's father, and the cops raided his house around 2 a.m. and they found a gun and marijuana, like a pound of marijuana, inside of the AC unit. And they said to my son's father, he was living there with 3 other roommates, and so there was 3 girls, 3 guys, and they said, if you say that it was your drugs to my son's father, then nobody in this house has to go to jail but you. But if you don't, then everybody has to go to jail because this is a common place and we don't know whose drugs it is. And I was a couple months pregnant at the time, and I remember thinking like, oh, like this is my one goal in life, you know, since I can't escape violence, and like I'm just gonna be like the perfect girlfriend, and you know, and say like, yeah, I'm gonna go to jail for you, and I'm gonna be a ride or die girl, and I'm gonna, you know, I'm not gonna care. I don't care. I'm gonna be hard now because I end up in jail, and that's what everybody seemed to do. And you come out and you have like street cred, which is like that, you know, you're more aggressive, you're more gangster or whatever. So I remember the police telling me like, talk to your boyfriend, tell him that, you know, say it's his drugs, you're pregnant, you don't want to end up in jail, because Rikers Island is a really big prison in New York, and it was always on the news for being people murdering each other in jail. And you know, in my heart I didn't want to go, but I was just like, no, it's fine, you don't have to say it's your drugs. And so I did end up going to jail for about a week before my mom ended up bailing me out. So about 7 months pregnant, I'm, you know, visiting my parole officer every week, and it's around Mother's Day. It's the day after Mother's Day, and I, you know, am broke. I don't have a job because I had morning sickness, and I quit my job, and I don't have any money. I don't have a cell phone. I was really, really depressed, and I was sleeping the whole day because it was Mother's Day, and I didn't want to call anybody. I was mad at my mom. I was mad at my grandmother, and so I'm like, I'm not going to wish anybody a happy Mother's Day. But something woke me up I think it was in the evening, and said, you need to call your family. And so since I didn't have any money and I didn't have a cell phone or like a house phone, I found a quarter in my boyfriend's room and walked a couple blocks to a payphone. And the first person I called, I don't remember, but I didn't get in contact with them. But then I called somebody else, and they said, where have you been? We've been trying to call you. Your grandfather, he died. He passed away last night, and we looked at his phone history, and he was trying to call you at 2 a.m., but he wasn't getting through to you. He also tried to dial 911, but he used the area code before he dialed 911, and so he didn't get the police either, and so he died in his sleep from a heart attack. I remember them shipping his body to Alabama because that's where all of my grandparents are, and his parents, and that's where he was the only one from living in New York at the time. And so I was really, really sad. I remember calling my father because I was broke and I didn't have any money, and I said, hey Dad, you know, my grandfather died, and he knew how much I loved my grandfather, so I'm like, surely he's gonna give me the money so I could fly to Alabama or get a Greyhound to Alabama and go to my granddad's funeral. And he says, oh, sorry, sweetie, I don't have any money. And I'm like, I was so angry because I'm like, you didn't take care of me my whole life. Now I'm 19 years old, and the only thing I want is $100 to buy a Greyhound ticket. And he said he didn't have any money, which I knew was a lie because he was still selling drugs and still had all the nice clothes and the jewelry and every big house. And so every year around Mother's Day, I would be severely depressed because I thought the only person who loved me in the world died. So around 21 years old, I ran away from my son's father because I found out that while I was pregnant, I was trying to go to school at the time, and I looked on his computer and found out that he actually had another girl pregnant and brought my son, who was a baby, to his other girlfriend's baby shower and had pictures with, and my son's name is Aiden, and he decided he was going to name this other girl's baby Kaden. And I was so mad because I'm like, that's my son's name and you're still cheating on me. So I ran away. I had got my GED. I dropped out because I dropped out at 12th grade. And I'm living with my grandmother again. And when she told me, I told my mom, I said, you know, I'm moving away, I'm running away because my son's father hit me. And she said, well, sweetie, what did you do to deserve it? And I'm just like, what is wrong with you people? Because I grew up with, you know, everyone was dating people. They never got married, but they were all abusive. And so, I mean, I was used to seeing people abused by their spouses, but I didn't want that. And so it was just normalized. And I'm like, you guys are crazy if you think this is normal. And so I stopped speaking to my mom for a long time after that because I was mad that she thought I deserved to get hit. So then my mom's nowhere in the picture until one day she decided she was going to run away from her pimp boyfriend. So she comes and lives with my grandmother. So now it's my mom, my sister, me, my brother, my aunt, my grandmother, her boyfriend. We're all living in a 2-bedroom apartment. Until one day, my mom gets a phone call from her boyfriend, her pimp, and he says, I'm gonna kill all the dogs because they had a lot of dogs and sheep, and let you come meet with me. And so she decides, I'm gonna go meet with him, even though we begged her not to because we thought that he was gonna like kill her or something. And she never comes back home. So we spent the week calling hospitals and calling shelters trying to find out what happened to her. And her boyfriend changed his number, and so we had no contact for about 2 years, so we had no idea what happened to her. One day, it was the summer, and it was my brother's birthday, and we got a phone call on my grandmother's house phone, and it was my mom. Of course, everybody was mad at her because they were mad that she ran away for 2 years with this guy, and we thought that she was dead. And she says, like, no, I just, we ran away to North Carolina to start a new life, to start over, and, we're doing so much better, and nobody wants to speak to her except for me because that's my mom, and I'm like, I love you regardless. So I told her I want to come see her. So since I'm a spontaneous person, I told her I wanted to go see her. So the next day I was on a Greyhound and with my son, and I went to go see her. And I didn't tell anybody I was going because I knew no one liked her and everyone was mad at her. So when I got back, I don't know if I told a family member or I posted on social media because I thought no one was looking, but my grandmother found out I went to go see my mom, and she said, I can't believe you went to go see her, you're so ungrateful, get out my house, and not those words, but she told me to get out my house with my son. And so I was like mad anyway, so I'm just like, whatever, I'll leave, and so the next week I spent sending out applications to everywhere in North Carolina, and I get a bunch of job interviews lined up because I had been a manager in Taco Bell's and Burger King's, and so I was applying to the same places down here. And I get interviews, and I decide I'm going to move to North Carolina with my son. At the time, he's about 2 years old. And I'm going to run away from everybody because everybody up here treats me like crap. So, I don't know how I ended up getting a job, but I drove down here the same day I had set up an interview to North Carolina. And I was going to be late because there was traffic, and I called the guy and I said, hey, can I reschedule because I'm late, it's going to be traffic? And he says, no, you have to get interviewed today because I'm going to be gone for the next week or something. And I'm like, but I'm not dressed appropriately. I have on a belly shirt and these little tiny shorts. I'm not dressed for an interview. And he's like, it's fine, just come in. So I have no idea, but he hired me by the grace of God. So now I'm working as a manager in North Carolina in Gastonia. No, that was Mo Hickory. I have my own apartment. I'm doing good. I'm with my son, and they asked me to fill in for another store, and they were short a manager, and so I say, yeah, the store was in Gastonia. And so I go to Gastonia, and this guy's about to get off, and they say, if you have any problems tonight, because the store was closing at 3 a.m., they say, if you have any problems, call this number. This guy, he'll help you. And they gave me his number, so around, I guess, 2 a.m., the store closes, and I called the number, and I knew it was super late, and I actually didn't need any help, but I just wanted to talk to somebody, so we ended up talking till about 7 a.m., and then when I asked, I said, oh, actually, do you have a girlfriend? And he says, yeah, she's laying here right next to me, and she's sleeping, even though I've been talking to her for about 4 hours. And I got silent because I was just like, oh, you're just like every other guy. Like, why? I keep getting bad guys. And he says, he thought I was serious, and so he says, I'm just joking. Why would I be talking to you for 4 hours if I had a girlfriend laying next to me? This guy's my husband now. He's the first guy that I ever met was a Christian. He told me he was a Christian. He told me that he was celibate, and I was like, what is that, an STD? And so his parents were the first black people that I ever knew that were married legally, because growing up people were together and they just said, oh yeah, we're husband and wife, but they weren't actually legally married. And so I didn't know that people even got married. And I know that sounds crazy, but it's true. If you were just with somebody long enough, they called it like common law, and so you were married. And so he was raised Christian, and needless to say, his parents, he was in college, and his parents were like, I do not want you dating this ghetto girl who has a drug dealer dad and a prostitute mom. And he brought me to church one day with his parents, and I remember the first time I was in church as an adult, because I was in church as a young kid one time when my grandmother sent me with my brother's friends, and they were up there and they were like putting oil on people's heads, and then everybody would fall back. And so I'm like, okay, I guess this is what church is about. So I go up to the front, they put oil on my head, I fall back, and there was no one there to catch me when I saw everybody else getting caught. And so I fall straight onto the ground, bump my head, I'm crying on the ground, but I didn't want to get up because I was too embarrassed. And so I laid there until someone came and, checked on me, and I'm like, okay, I guess this is what church is. And so I'm thinking the church is going to be the same thing, which it wasn't. So I get there, and I'm in church. This is my first time in church as an adult. And I was very sad because my son went to visit his biological father in Connecticut, and he wasn't answering my phone call, so I thought he was running away with my kid because he definitely said that he was going to. And I remember saying, like, okay, you guys say that this Jesus is real, so it must be like magic. And so I remember them doing an altar call, which I didn't know that that's what it was. I just thought they were like, come pray. And so I'm like, okay, like, I want my son back, so. I get down, I go down to the altar call, and the lady's like, well, what are you here for? And I tell her, I'm like, my son's in Connecticut, his father's not answering the phone, he changed his phone number, I don't think he's gonna give me back my son. And so she ended up praying for me and then asked me if I believed in Jesus. And I'm like, yeah, I believe in Jesus. Is he gonna get my son back? So I ended up like, oh, they're like, you're a believer now. They give me like a paper that said January 31st, 2011, I think it was. And I'm like, okay, I'm a believer. And so I ended up getting baptized, which I didn't know I didn't really know anything. And I told my husband, I'm like, you're gonna marry me. And he was like, no, I'm not. And I was like, yeah, you're gonna marry me. And he was just like, okay. He tells the story and says that I told him God told me that he was going to marry me, which I don't remember, but I probably did because I was a liar. So I probably did say that God told me to marry him. I just wanted to marry him because I found out he was the only guy in the world that I thought wasn't cheating. So I'm like, you're going to marry me because you're not a cheater. So now I am a believer, and my husband decides he was going to buy me a King James Version Bible. Don't hate me, the guys who read King James Version Bibles, but I'm reading it and I'm like, what in the world is this Shakespeare poetry? I have no idea what they're talking about. I'm not going to read this. And so I still have this Bible to this day, but the only reason why I have it is because my husband wrote in it. And so that's the only reason why I keep it. But I never read it. We went to church every week, and I stopped cursing because that was the only thing that I thought I was doing wrong. And I stopped listening to certain music because I'm like, I didn't even know the 10 Commandments or anything, but I was like, I'm perfect. I stopped cursing. I stopped listening to bad music. And so a couple years later, I'm dealing with super bad anxiety. I'm having really bad panic attacks to the point where I thought I was having a heart attack. I was hospitalized multiple times, thinking that I was going to die. And social anxiety does run in my family. So when I mean runs in my family, I mean my mom has it, my grandmother has it, my aunts, my uncles, sisters, brothers, like everybody was diagnosed with social anxiety. So I'm like struggling with anxiety, and I'm on disability at the time because I'm pregnant and I can't work because I'm panicking every time I'm at work. And then I give birth, and now I'm struggling with postpartum depression, but I didn't know that that's what it was. But I'm super depressed. I'm on medication, and I'm like, man, the one thing I didn't want to be on growing up, because I said I was going to be different than my family, I didn't want to be on medication for depression or anxiety, but I am like everybody else. And so my husband says, he graduates from college and says, if I find a job making a certain amount of money, will you stop working? Because we were both working as managers in fast food. And I say, sure, like, yeah, I will. But in my head, I wanted to, but I didn't think he was gonna get a job making that certain amount of money. So I was like, yes, of course. And so then one day he comes in and is like, guess what, baby? I made that job, that certain amount of money, you can stop working. And I'm like, wait. I was just joking. And so I didn't want to stop working because I was raised that, you're a black woman, you have to be single, that you have to, rely on yourself, you can't rely on no man. And so even though we were married, I still was holding on to my separate identity, thinking that, I can't trust him, he's not going to take care of me if I stop working. If I stop working, I'm going to have 2 kids now. So my husband ended up moving to Charleston by himself, and he started working, and he would work 6 days a week, and on the 7th day, on his day off, he would come and visit. And at the time I was just like, what's wrong with me? Why did I get married? I could be single. I could, because I was up for a promotion at work, and I'm like, I don't need him. He can move to Charleston, and I'll just, live in Charlotte area and work and put my kids in daycare and school, and everything will be fine. But I was really convicted that my life wasn't going good anyway, and so I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna move to Charleston. So I ended up moving to Charleston, and I stopped working. Then I started homeschooling because the school that I put my son in, they said he, was struggling to read, and I'm like, we would come home and do homework till 9 p.m. and I was just like, I don't want to do homework till 9 p.m. and then have to wake up and bring you to school and get ready at 6 a.m. And so I stopped working, and then I started homeschooling just because I didn't want to do school with him till 9 p.m. And I met a girl and on a play date, and she says, oh, our kids are similar age, I had cut my hair recently, and she said, we look alike, our kids are the same age, and she was a legit Christian. And she was the first Christian woman that I met that was like a legit Christian. And I'm like, oh wait, I told her I was a Christian, but then when she started talking, I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I was embarrassed. I'm like, wow, you're a legit Christian. So I tell her we were looking for a church in Charleston, and she's like, come to my church. And so we go to her church, and everyone there was super friendly, and I loved it. I'm telling my husband, like, oh, we need to go back every week. And he was like, I don't like that church. He was raised Baptist, so those preachers and I was just like, I didn't know anything about Baptists or anything, so I'm just like, whatever you're talking about, I love this church, This church was mainly Caucasian, so it was probably only 2 other black families there, and he didn't like the music because it was contemporary music, and he was used to very, I don't know, it was Baptist music, I don't know, gospel music, so he was used to gospel music. He's like, I don't like this church, but he kept going because he knew that this was the only church that I was actually liked and wanted to go to. So this is still the same church that we go to 10 years later, maybe 11 years now. But so he did start liking it. This is the church where I ended up getting baptized again, when I actually started walking with the Lord, and where I started reading my Bible. But I actually realized that I was a sinner, and that I needed a Savior, and that I had more sins than actually just cursing in the songs that I listened to. And this is where I want to encourage you guys, because I don't know where you are in your life or whether you consider yourself a believer or anything, but I want to encourage you that Jesus is way more patient than I think people give him credit for. He's way more forgiving than I even believe that he was. It took me probably close to 3 years from the time in 2011 from going down there on an altar call before I actually started reading my Bible. And so the first 3 years I was just calling myself a Christian. And I would be the person in prayer groups. We would have prayer groups, and I would be scared to pray because I was scared that people would notice that I wasn't a real Christian, but then I would blame it on my anxiety. I would be like, oh, I have social anxiety. Social anxiety runs in my family, so I'm not going to pray with you guys in your prayer group because, I'm anxious. And people believe me, but I knew that the truth was that I didn't want to pray because I didn't know what I was praying for or to who or anything like that. And I definitely didn't want to say the wrong thing. And so I didn't, and I was still struggling with anxiety, and we bought our first home. We're living in this home, and I didn't know how to cook. My husband was the cook of the family up until this point, and my son actually told my manager that I burnt boxed macaroni and cheese because I didn't know that you could follow instructions on the back of recipe, on the backs of boxes. And so when people would ask, do your mom know how to cook? And he's like, no, she burns boxed macaroni and cheese. I would be the person who, undercooked the noodles because I didn't know that you could just look at the back of the recipe and it'll tell you to cook it for 10 minutes. And so I would just look at it and be like, I think it looks ready. And then it would come out and it would be super hard. I only knew how to bake chicken. And so anytime my husband would try to cook, I would put the chicken in the oven because I definitely didn't want fried chicken, but that's the only chicken that I knew about growing up. And so I remember my friend was I told her, I was like, I want to be a homemaker. I want to learn how to break bread. I want to learn how to do all the things. And so she gives me her mom's recipe books because she was gluten intolerant. And so she's like, I have no need for this, but my mom gave me all of these recipes to make bread. And so she's like, you just got to follow this recipe. And so I'm like, okay. I go to Whole Food and I'm looking for yeast and brewer's yeast to bake bread. And I come home with nutritional yeast because I didn't know that it was a different thing. And I try to make bread with nutritional yeast and it comes out hard, if you can imagine. And I call and I'm like, I baked bread, but it didn't come out right. And she's like, well, did your yeast bubble? And I'm like, no. And she's like, well, maybe your yeast is bad. Just try it again and make sure it bubbles. So I tried it again and it still didn't, bake bread. And then finally, I don't remember how I realized, but I think I told her oh, I use nutritional yeast. And she was like, girl, that is not the same yeast. And I was like, oh. And so then Thanksgiving comes and I'm like, I want to learn how to cook. I'm going to follow these recipes. And I'm from New York, and if you say kickin means like, oh, it's so good. And so I find this recipe that says kickin collard greens, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna make kickin collard greens. It's gonna be the best collard greens ever. And I bring it to the Thanksgiving dinner where we have about 12 kids, and I didn't know that kickin meant that it was gonna be spicy. And so, even though I followed the recipe, so I put the red pepper flakes in there and I put the black pepper, but I didn't even know those things were spicy. So people start eating and they're like, wow, you're burning our lips. Like, what did you do to these collard greens? And I'm like, I just followed the recipe and it was called kickin collard greens. And they're like, kickin means spicy. And I was like, oh, I didn't know that. I'm from New York. Kickin means like good. So that was funny. Around the same time, I started learning about how food impacts your body because my son was about 5 years old and he was off the walls. He was crazy, he was hyper, and I was just like, this is like something we gotta give. And so we did allergy tests and intolerant tests, and I found out that he was actually allergic to red food coloring, and I was giving him red food coloring and everything. And so once I took out the red food coloring, I'm like, oh, I didn't even know that, food, impacts what you eat or anything like that. And so once we took out that red food coloring, he calmed down a bit. But then I started watching all of these food documentaries about like Food Inc. and like food being that medicine and fat, sick, and nearly dead. And I'm like, wow, like who knew that, food impacts, how you live and how you feel. And so I decided, well, since organic produce is too expensive, I'm going to grow a garden. And so since I am obsessive, I start Googling all the things about gardening, and I grow a garden, and my garden is wonderful the first year. And except for, I didn't know that organic produce is going to have bugs. And so I'm getting this lettuce, I'm getting all this produce, and I'm like, what in the world is this? Like, this lettuce does not look like the lettuce inside the store. It has bugs all over it. It's dirty. You wash it and the bugs are still on it. My kids would laugh that they were eating salad with bugs on it because I couldn't wash the lettuce enough. And so I started giving away my produce to everybody in the neighborhood, and then I realized, oh, I can grow a garden, but I don't want to eat it. And so I'm going to, give it away since lettuce wasn't triple washed. And then I found out watermelons had seeds in it, and I never knew watermelons had seeds in it. And I was just like, what kind of watermelon is this? And so I started giving away all my produce and then going to the grocery store anyway and buying nice packaged food. And so I ended up spending way more money on produce anyway, because now I'm buying produce and I have a garden, but I'm not eating from the garden. And I had friends in the neighborhood who had chickens, and I was like, chickens are creepy, they look like little dinosaurs. So although we could have chickens, I was like, I'm not gonna have chickens. And then I had friends that had goats, and I was like, I'm not gonna have goats because they have little creepy eyes and they look like aliens. And so I'm like, I just want to live on a farm, because apparently in my brain I thought if I lived on a farm, then I would want to eat the produce. I don't know, I thought maybe they would make the bugs go away. I'm just like, if I have more space, since we're only on a quarter of an acre, I'm like, I'll just wait until we get, more space, and I'll have a cow instead of goats. And when I look back on it, it's one of my greatest regrets that when I had that small urban homestead on a quarter of an acre, that I didn't do what I could have done on it. I didn't raise animals, I didn't have a goat, I didn't learn animal husbandry skills, I didn't learn how to can, I didn't learn how to bake bread, really. I had this idea that once I got a bigger homestead, so I started telling my husband, I want to be a farmer, we need to buy, acres, and I had this idea that, maybe bigger acres would make me forget about bugs, or that the mosquitoes was gonna bite you all up and eat you, and that the summer in the south and the humidity was gonna kill you. And I'm just like, okay, I'm gonna forget about all those things when I have more acres. And so the homestead that we're on now, it wasn't my dream homestead, but like I said, we were in COVID during everything, and we thought we were gonna end up in a bunch of acres. I told my husband, I want at least 5 acres, and he's like, I want like 15 or 100. And I'm like, okay, whatever, as long as you get me at least 5, we'll be good. And I'll start gardening, I'll be a farmer, and I'll sell my produce, and then I'll start wanting to eat my produce that I'm growing, because then it won't have bugs, I guess, I imagine. I don't know, I believe the Lord was gonna bless me with a homestead. And I'm like, we're in our RV for about a year, and I'm like, Lord, where's my homestead? I thought you said you were going to bless me with a homestead, and now COVID is here and the world's going to end, and I don't have a homestead. And I was mad at the Lord, and I'm just like, we kept getting outbidded for houses, And, you know, because at this time, if you didn't see a house the first day that it came on the market, you would get outbidded. And so I was frustrated because we're living in this small RV trailer and we're parked and stationary. I can't garden, so I can't do the one thing that I love. And I had been reading and watching about homesteading on small scale. So I'm like, you know what? I'm like, forget about 5 acres, forget about 15 acres. I'm like, I'll take my corner lot again and I'll homestead on that, because at this point I'm just like giving up all hope that we're gonna end up on any acres. And so when the house that we're on now came on the market, I remember we weren't going to be able to see it for 3 days, and I was just like, oh yeah, we're scheduled to see this house in 3 days, but I know we're not going to get it because every other house that we saw after the first day, you know, we got outbidded. And so I wasn't happy that we couldn't see it the first day, but I don't remember why we couldn't see it for the first 3 days. And we get there and we found out it has other bids, and we're like, yeah, this is going to be another house that we get outbidded for. But we made our bid, and then we actually got accepted. And I was like, whoa, like, wow, that's crazy. Like, you know, we finally got our first exception, because the first house that we actually did get accepted on, came to closing. We had moved all of our stuff out of storage that we put in storage. And the day we were going to close at 2 at noon, we found out that we couldn't close because the day before my husband lost his job, the first time he ever lost his job in his life. And so then we get to this homestead and we close on it, and it feels surreal, and it wasn't what I imagined at all. But this is the homestead that we're at now, and it's what the Lord knew that I needed, and He was faithful even when I wasn't faithful. And I just want to encourage you guys that, you know, the Lord's loving even when you're not loving and kind to Him, and that He gives the best gifts. And my husband now leads an evangelist group where on Saturdays, and we go out and we preach the gospel to people on Saturdays. And I always, my message to people is always about His grace and His love and mercy, and that, you know, no matter how much sin that you have in the world or bad things that happen to you, that His grace is sufficient for you and it'll always be enough for you. And so I just want to encourage you that if you lack faith, that, you know, He has enough faith to make you faithful. And it's my personal opinion that the message of grace gets lost sometimes in salvation. People think that they have to be perfect, and I want to encourage you that I'm definitely not perfect, and I didn't grow up in a perfect life, but I'm here now. And, you know, I just want to encourage you that Jesus loves you, and that He's willing to accept you with open arms, and that He'll love you like a father. I remember getting over my grandfather passing when my friend shared with me Psalm 27:10 that said, though father and mother forsake you, you, O Lord, take me in. And I held on to that truth, and I hold on to that truth now, that the Lord has a spiritual family for you, just like He did me. And so, yeah, thank you guys for listening. And I just want to encourage you that if you're waiting on your homestead, that keep on praying and seeking the Lord, because He says seek Him first and everything will be added to you. And yeah, thank you guys for listening, and I appreciate it. Another round of applause for Dominique.